What if Rosemary Clooney got into New Jack Swing? This week we'll be celebrating Rosemary Clooney, a pre-rock and roll pop great who's sadly often overlooked in this day and age. And we'll also be taking a little look at New Jack Swing, the futuristic fusion of R&B and hip-hop that revolutionised the pop landscape in the late 80s and early 90s. All that and more on this week's What If, How and Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If videos on my YouTube channel. And then on Wednesdays, one of these companion videos where I discuss the artists and genres involved in the What If video, and also share a little bit of my creative process. The idea of the What If videos is that each week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, sung by Rosemary Clooney, and I tried to reimagine that as a New Jack Swing song, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
Makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. Give that rhythm everything you got. It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing.
So the idea for this week's video kind of came about because I like to watch a bunch of different music producers on YouTube, just seeing how people produce different genres of music, pick up a few tips here and there. And one of the guys I occasionally take a look at was doing a bit of a tutorial on New Jack Swing. And I just thought, oh, that's interesting. That's a genre I haven't attempted, and there's some interesting sounds in there. Could be quite a fun one to dive into. Wasn't sure what song to try and convert into that style, but then it just popped into my head that it would be amusing, to me at least, to remake It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing in the New Jack Swing style. So I just needed to pick one of the many versions of the song that had been recorded to use for the video. Ideally, I wanted it to be a version by someone who was still performing into the 1990s, because I had this idea that in my alternative universe it would be their comeback record or whatever. And my immediate thought was Tony Bennett, who I knew had done a version, but listening to a few different versions by him, in his performances he tended to use it just as a bit of a launch pad for improvisation, which is quite a common thing. So he'll just come out, sing a cursory verse, and then everyone in the band takes a solo and that's it, which wasn't exactly ideal for my purpose. So I listened to a few other people's renditions of the song and eventually came across Rosemary Clooney's version with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, and that's an excellent recording of the song, perfect for what I needed. And I hadn't thought about Rosemary Clooney at all, because sadly in this day and age she does seem to be largely forgotten, and I do think that's a bit of a shame. If people have heard of her at all now, it's normally down to either just the fact that she was George Clooney's aunt, or failing that, they know her because she starred in White Christmas, a film which obviously still appears in the TV schedules every year without fail. But she did so much more than that, and in the pre-rock and roll pop landscape, she was a fairly significant figure. It started out her recording career, I think, in the late 40s, mainly recording as a duo with her sister Betty, who sadly died pretty young from, I think, an aneurysm, which is a terrible thing. But then she, as you get into the 50s, she branched out as a solo artist, and her career really took off when she started being produced by Mitch Miller, who was an interesting character and definitely a very talented producer, but also probably one of the people who's most responsible for the fact that people don't tend to look back very fondly on the pre-rock and roll pop music of the 50s, because he was given to producing some fairly ridiculous novelty records. Had a real knack for picking up ideas for novel hooks that people hadn't heard in records before, that would catch people's attention, catch people's ear, even if they did so by being kind of annoying. So Rosemary Clooney's first really significant hit comes from a Mitch Miller production, which was the song Come On My House, which is one of the fewer records that you do occasionally hear kicking around these days. It crops up in adverts and things occasionally. Several of her other hits followed in a sort of similarly novelty kind of vein. Things like Mambo Italiano, obviously kind of cashing in on the mambo craze of that era of the 50s, and also playing on some ethnic stereotypes which maybe wouldn't fly in this day and age. But she'd recorded a wide variety of material outside these novelty hits too, had some pretty significant country-leaning hits around that time. big hit with a version of Half As Much, which was obviously made famous by the great Hank Williams, and also the original version of This Old House, which people of my age from the UK definitely remember more from the Shakin' Stevens version. And at the same time as she was doing that, she was recording a bunch of big show tunes, huge hit with Hey There from the Pajama Game, things like that. And then was also recording with a bunch of the popular big bands of the age, the Harry James Orchestra, the Benny Goodman Orchestra, and, as in this week's track, the Duke Ellington Orchestra. I think it was that side of her work that she was most proud of, and I think that's the role that she really wanted to be remembered for the most. So for that first half of the 1950s, she had a really, really great run of hits, film appearances, she had a TV show, really pretty big celebrity. But then, as is the case with a lot of entertainers of her generation, rock and roll comes round. She didn't really have an immediate answer to that, partly just due to the fact that she was starting a family around that time, so her career momentum was somewhat stalled by the fact that she was giving birth and raising kids, not concentrating on figuring out how she was going to present herself in this changed musical landscape. Also, unbeknownst to the general public at the time, she was struggling a lot with mental health issues, which certainly in the 1950s and early 60s, I'm pretty sure both diagnoses and treatments of a bunch of mental health issues weren't particularly reliable. So she's receiving medication for these things. It's not necessarily helping her depression, but she's becoming dependent on the medication as well. I think eventually in 1968, she had just an onstage breakdown and retired completely from public life. And at the time, it probably seemed like that was the last anyone was going to see of her. It emerged later on that she'd actually been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which, again, I don't know if people had any real clue how to treat that at the time. And instead of being able to take the time to figure out how to deal with that condition, she was just on the showbiz treadmill, so just keeping going. But she took some time off, and then with the help of Bing Crosby, who I think encouraged her to get back into the business while he himself was having a bit of a late career resurgence in the 1970s, she did actually make a comeback, and from that point onwards recorded really consistently all the way through the 80s and even just into the 21st century. And her new material, mostly on the Concord label, which is a specialist jazz label, definitely leaned back into that big band jazz style that she'd been most happy singing in back in her earlier career. And she did some really good stuff in that vein, as well as still branching out, collaborating with people from the more middle of the road collaborations with the likes of Barry Manilow to, I was delighted to discover just earlier this week, my favourite collaboration of hers with Wildman Fisher, the great outsider artist. It's kind of a street singer. It's singing these strange, sometimes funny, sometimes disturbing, surreal streams of consciousness. But yeah, they came together in 1986 to record a duet, and it's actually really pleasing. So definitely check that out on YouTube. It's well worth a listen. Very odd, but quite sweet and quite entertaining. So yeah, she overcame a lot, and if she never returned to the mainstream spotlight, she did have a pretty impressive career resurgence and kept performing, as I say, right into the 21st century, right up to until she finally passed away from lung cancer. And as I say, in the years since, odd traces of her career do occasionally pop up in the mainstream. There have been a few tracks that have been used on, as I say, adverts. Her recording of the song Sway was heavily sampled for Sway (Mucho Mambo) by the dance act Shaft, although legal issues prevented her vocal from actually being used in the version that was released, so they got some sound alike in to re-record it. But a few things like that put her back into the spotlight, but she'd never really received that level of respect or critical reappraisal that a bunch of her contemporaries have had. And she was just a really excellent, diverse singer and a fantastic all-around entertainer with a pretty impressive recorded legacy. So even if you're not curious enough to go on a deep dive, I would definitely recommend checking out at least her work with Duke Ellington and also with Wildman Fisher, which is a heck of a combination. But yeah, while Rosemary Clooney was reviving her career as a swing singer throughout the latter half of the 80s and into the 90s, the mainstream pop charts were being taken over by a different kind of swing, that being, of course, New Jack Swing. I think now if people hear some of those records and look at the fashions and the dancing that went with it, it seems like a bit of a nostalgic curiosity, but it was actually such a dominant sound in pop at the time, kind of really took over so much of mainstream pop, to the point that even though although you'd generally say that the New Jack Swing movement had lost its momentum by the mid-90s, by that point, elements of it had crept into so much other pop music that it was kind of everywhere, and you can still hear the influence of it in all kinds of pop music to this day. People will argue about the exact origins of it as a style. I know there's some people who claim that Oh Louise by Junior, the old British R&B singer, was maybe the first New Jack Swing sound. It certainly has that 16th note shuffle in the rhythm that is characteristic of New Jack Swing, although it's a much more natural kind of acoustic drum feel. But yeah, hearing that in an R&B context I think was maybe a bit of a step towards the New Jack Swing sound. For me, as far as I can gather, the sound as we know it comes from combining that kind of thing with the Minneapolis funk sound that Prince and his cohort had been developing from the late 70s onwards, which blends funk and R&B with sort of cutting-edge electronica in a way that made it sound completely fresh for the 1980s. So you're taking this Minneapolis electro-funk sound and adding the idea of this syncopated shuffling rhythm, and that's the basis of New Jack Swing. And the producers who, to my ears at least, first really created a fully realised version of that were Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, who had formerly been collaborators with Prince in the time, and they started producing other acts in the mid-80s. And one of their characteristic production touches was the use of the Roland TR-808, famous drum machine. When Roland had brought it out, it wasn't particularly successful because although people were keen to use new technology to save on having to use acoustic drummers, it was considered to not sound very authentic. The drums sounded really artificial and kind of plasticky rather than like a real drum. But the Minneapolis sound had made a point of including these artificial, futuristic, obviously technologically created sounds in its blend. So that kind of became the backbone of their signature sound, coupled with the fact that somewhere along the lines they discovered that there's a swing feature on it, so you can program in a rhythm with straight 16th notes and then turn up the swing feature and you get this instant shuffling funk that's the backbone of all New Jack Swing. So they quickly became really in-demand producers for this signature sound, especially after they recorded with Janet Jackson. I think they produced the Control album, which kind of really put her on the map, and then went on to develop the sound further with Rhythm Nation as well. And while this is all happening, you get other producers coming in, picking up on the sound, adding their own elements, notably Teddy Riley, who later went on to have his own success with Blackstreet, but he starts producing other people as well, ending up with this new sound that has this shuffling drum machine rhythm at its core, still using elements of contemporary soul and R&B and jazz funk, but then incorporating elements of hip-hop, particularly the use of samples. So it's a really fresh sound, and it takes over the R&B scene of the latter half of the 80s, the likes of New Edition, and then from New Edition, Bobby Brown and Belle Biv DeVoe, as I say, Blackstreet, En Vogue, all having variants of this new sound. Michael Jackson, by the time he gets around to the Dangerous album, he's parted ways with Quincy Jones and he really leans into this New Jack Swing style as well. And it was just everywhere. For a good many years, that was the dominant sound. At first in R&B, but then in pop in general. You start to see pop producers just incorporating elements of it into their sounds, from Stock Aitken and Waterman to Max Martin. So even when the public begins to slightly tire of this pure New Jack Swing sound and new trends emerge in R&B and hip-hop that start to overtake that sound, by that point it's already kind of filtered out into so much other stuff. So while in R&B, in hip-hop, your Dr. Dre's and your Timbalands might have come along to replace the Jam and Lewis sound, you can still hear echoes of it in mainstream pop into the 21st century. And if you think of those massive boy band hits that Max Martin produced for Backstreet Boys and NSYNC, they just owe a massive debt to the New Jack Swing sound. And then even now, you still get echoes of it in contemporary pop, and the likes of Bruno Mars particularly has very specifically revisited that sound as well. So it's been a remarkably enduring sound, and it's funny to think that it might not have existed if a couple of guys hadn't got fired from the time and discovered the swing function on an unpopular drum machine. But yeah, anyway, that takes me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, it's 1993. And Frank Sinatra's Duets record has just come out, the first one, which has been a massive hit. It's put Sinatra right back in the pop charts after years in the relative commercial wilderness. And Capitol Records, who released it, are very keen to strike while the iron's hot and follow up by rebooting the careers of a bunch of other classic vocalists of that era. So they're casting around just to see who's still active, who's doing well, who they think they could seize on next. And their attention falls on Rosemary Clooney. They can see that she's been consistently releasing some really good material throughout the previous decade, still in fine voice. So I think, oh, she might be a really good candidate. So their A&R guy reaches out to her and proposes that she come in and make a new record. She's delighted to hear from them and agrees to do it on the understanding that she'll be making a big band swing album. Unfortunately, this young producer who's assigned the project by Capitol misunderstands the assignment. The only form of swing that he knows is Swingbeat or the New Jack Swing, so that's what he assumes he's supposed to be doing for her. So they give him a list of songs and he prepares backing tracks in this New Jack Swing style. So Rosemary Clooney comes in to record and she's a little bit taken aback, but being the eternal professional that she is, she quickly recovers and sings her heart out nonetheless. Gets through the project even though she's a bit confused as to exactly what's going on. So the record comes out and the critics are not impressed. They're a little bit baffled by the whole thing. But one particular song from the record, a Swingbeat remake of the old classic It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, somehow catches on in clubs, starts becoming a bit of an underground favourite and is eventually released as a single and becomes a massive hit, making Rosemary Clooney suddenly an accidental New Jack Swing icon at the age of 65. So, in attempting to turn It Don't Mean a Thing into a New Jack Swing song, my first step as ever was getting the isolated vocal, popping into GarageBand, syncing up to the grid. It's not a particularly cleanly isolated vocal. There are bits and bobs of horns that remained on the vocal track, because I guess at the time it wouldn't have been recorded on a separate track. It probably was just her in a room with the orchestra. I took some of them out, but then some of them I just left on there because they sounded kind of cool, just popping up in the midst of the track. So anyway, that was all synced up. The next thing and most important thing was just getting the rhythm right. So I used two different drum machines, one of which was very much an 808 sound with that kind of really pokey, tinny, high snare sound that you want for New Jack Swing. And that's doing a fairly busy snare shuffle pattern, obviously with the tightly quantized swing feature put on there. So we've got that rattling away, mainly just doing a repeated pattern, but there's a little fill that crops up occasionally too. And then just to bolster that and give it a bit more depth and oomph, I've got a second drum machine on there which has a much fuller and punchier sound, so a much bassier kick drum and a much more impactful snare with a bit more of that gated reverb 80s kind of punch to it. And that's doing a much simpler pattern underneath, just reinforcing kind of the backbeat. I wanted to add some bass next. Synth bass, I figured, for New Jack Swing would probably be the way to go. So I've got a blend of two different sounds, one of which is a bit fuzzier and squelchier, and one of which is a little bit punchier and more percussive. Next thing was just a ton of keyboards basically, so I started out with a pad, filling in the sound, added some organ, because you get quite a lot of organ sounds in those old New Jack Swing things, doing some little rhythmic chordal bits, some synth brass, playing some little riffs, a couple of different synth brass sounds in various places, bell sounds, just some little chiming melodic motifs here and there. So just a variety of different synth sounds, filling out the track and adding little melodic details to mark out the different sections of the song. So it was already sounding pretty full, but I decided it'd be nice to have a couple of real instruments on there too, just to give it a bit more of that throwback 80s R&B feel too. So I added a guitar track with a clean, kind of chorusy, quite 80s sound, playing muted, funky, single note lines, very simple, quite percussive. And I threw in a little bit of bass guitar as well. As I say, the synth bass was providing most of the actual kind of bass frequencies in the track. So I used a super trebly bass sound and just threw in a few little bits of slaps and pops. Not all the way through, just in a few areas, just to add another funky 80s-ish touch, which I thought sounded pretty cool. Mixed way in the back so it's not too in your face. And then I figured I just needed to add a couple of samples to indicate that hip-hop influence on the genre as well. The main sample I used was actually just from the original Duke Ellington accompaniment to the vocal. Just sampled a nice kind of clean octave horn hit, which I then pitch shifted around to different places. So that provides quite a lot of the back end. It just kind of signposts chord changes throughout. And I wanted just a little speech sample somewhere, which would give a slight hint of that hip hoppiness as well. I'm trying to think what would fit in a song just about swing music. And for some reason, the song Swingin' Man by Black Flag sprang to mind, which is very far removed from the genre that we're going for, but I dived into it and managed to find a really good little clip of Henry Rollins screaming Swingin' Man, which I sampled and sped up massively so it didn't sound remotely like Henry Rollins. And so that just kind of crops up occasionally. Again, not particularly in the foreground, but just a fun little kind of detail that might catch your ear as you're listening. And then for the video, started out as ever by just finding some footage of Rosemary Clooney performing the track. I don't know if it was actually from the 90s or from the late 80s, but it's certainly from around the era that the track's supposed to be from. And the version that she's performing is actually quite a different arrangement from the Duke Ellington one, so I had to do some chopping around to try and make it seem like she was singing that particular vocal, but it doesn't exactly sync up, but it's not too far off. And then I really wanted to represent the dance culture around New Jack Swing because there's such a distinctive dance style that goes with that music. So found loads of cool clips of people doing these retro New Jack Swing dances, picked a few of my favourites and just synced some of those up and intercut those with the performance. And then as a final touch, just mocked up a couple of concert posters to suggest that Rosemary Clooney's there during the New Jack Swing era, performing on bills with some of these notable performers as well. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I suspect it's probably not going to be one of my most popular ones because I don't know how many people remembered Rosemary Clooney or have any particular appetite to hear her singing New Jack Swing, but generally I only really do this channel to amuse myself, and this one did amuse me, so I certainly had fun, even if no one else does. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like, share, subscribe, all that stuff really helps the channel. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or songs or genres you'd like me to take a look at, I always welcome your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.